Hi everyone, today I am here to show you a quick tutorial on how to do foundation paper piecing, also called FPP. Foundation paper piecing is a little bit different from regular piecing because instead of just sewing two pieces of fabric together like you usually would, kind of like this, and then sew the seam here, you're actually sewing the fabric onto a foundation, onto the paper, as the name suggests. And it can be a little confusing because it's something that we're not used to doing, but also you are kind of sewing everything backwards. So you're not sewing onto the shape here, you actually have the fabric on the opposite side, and then you have to turn it over and sew on the lines on the paper. So the first thing that we need to do after printing your pattern is to make sure that it printed at the correct size. All foundation paper piecing patterns should have a way for you to test that the scale is correct. In this case, there is a 1-inch square test, and what we do is we just take a ruler and place it right on top of it to make sure that it is actually 1 inch. If it's correct, then that means that the rest of the pattern is the correct size. If it's off in any kind of way, then you need to go back to your printer settings and see what happened and why it's not been printed the correct size. So now that we know that this has been printed the correct size, what we have to do is trim around it. And as you can see here, there is kind of this shaded part. This is my seam allowance on the block, so I want to trim outside of that. And you can trim right on it, but I like to leave just a little bit and then kind of trim to size once I am done piecing the whole block. So now that I've trimmed out my block, it's time to start sewing. And as you can see on the pattern here, there's numbers, and it's for each section has its own number. And those numbers tell you the order on which you're sewing your fabric onto the paper. So we're gonna start by putting fabric to cover section 1. So it actually goes on the wrong side, and it's probably gonna be a little hard to see here. So maybe you can see it here, how the fabric, you can kind of see the shading of the fabric. It's outside of, it's bigger than section 1, and that's what we want. Now, to make sure that your fabric doesn't move, you can either pin it, or what I like to do is actually use just some glue. As long as it's washable glue, you're good to go. And what I do is just put a little dab there on section 1. Put my fabric on top, and then you take your iron and press it, and that sets the glue. So I just took it to my iron and pressed it on there, so now you can see it doesn't move. And one thing I forgot to mention is that you want to make sure that when it's here on the back side, the fabric, it's right side up as you're looking at it, because this is actually the back of the block. Next step is to do the fabric for section 2. So section 2, it's on this side, and what you would maybe want to do is just kind of pop it there and then sew your stitch here. But then when you go to press it, what's going to happen is that you only have that. So you're kind of working backwards. So you're actually putting it on this side. You're going to be sewing here. So then when I turn it and press it, section 2 is covered. So what I like to do in order to make sure that I'm actually covering that section is I like to score my paper and fold it. So I just use my ruler, and I like to use just my seam ripper, and don't press too hard because otherwise you'll rip the paper, but just score the paper and then fold it. So now I can kind of see where section 2 starts and ends. So I know that I have to cover that much. So that when I open it, it covers section 2. This is gonna make a lot more sense why I actually do it. So I'm on my sewing machine now, and one thing that you want to make sure it's over here, you can kind of see at the corner my stitch length. Regularly I have it at 2 when I'm just piecing regularly. However, for foundation paper piecing, I always bring it down to 1.5. You can do 1.5, 1.8. The point is to make those stitches smaller. That makes ripping the paper off at the end much easier. And what I'm gonna do now is sew this first seam between sections 1 and 2. I'm gonna bring it to my machine, and I'm gonna start all the way off because you want to sew that seam in that seam allowance, and I'm gonna stop right here. So now I am back at my cutting little section, and what I want to do is trim here so we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to use that previous crease, and I'm just going to take my ruler and trim my excess fabric, and just make sure that I'm leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And here's the part where you're gonna be careful, because sometimes when I get in the groove, I press, and then I go over and fold it and trim, and then I realize, oh, I trimmed my actual fabric. So what you're doing is you're pressing, but then you're moving it over, trimming, and then putting it back in place. So now we're gonna go back to the other side, and here we have sections 1 and 2 done. So next is section 3, and section 3 is the same as section 2. So I have my piece of fabric here, and again, I can just kind of guess here. If I put it here and then fold it, that would be pretty good. Or we can do the folding method that I showed you, where I turn it over and I am going to crease here. And then place this white fabric in such a way that I know when all of this is open, it covers section 3. So there we go. And now I am going to sew the seam. So here you can see I've sewn the second seam between sections 1 and 3. And so now the next thing to do is to trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And then I'm going to open this again and press here. And you can take it to your iron and press it, or you can finger press it. Now we have sections 1, 2, and 3 done. It's time for section 4. And so I have all of my green fabric here, and I'm gonna take this piece because I can see that it's wider than what I need, and you also want it to be taller than what you need. So I can see here this more than covers section 4. So I'm gonna do the same thing again. I am going to crease here. And when I place it, I want to make sure that it's covering section 4. Okay, so I am back at my trimming station. This is before pressing. I am going to fold the paper over and trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And then I am going to press this. So now I just pressed this, and now we've completed sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. And up until now, they've been pretty regular seams. And by that I mean just straight seams. We could actually have done all of these with just regular piecing. Now comes in the beauty of foundation paper piecing, where you can work these strange sort of irregular angles that you can't do with regular piecing. So a natural thing to want to do at this point for section 5 is kind of turn it over and just kind of plop the green piece of fabric, sew the seam, and then when you press it, kind of hope that it covers that section the right way. But when you're working with these strange angles, you kind of want to take that guessing out of it. And this is really when that creasing method that I use really comes in handy. I am going to crease this again, and I'm going to crease between sections 4 and 5 because that's our next seam. And again, you don't want to press too hard because you don't want to rip the paper. But so here. So then when I am placing the fabric that's gonna cover section 5, which is this fabric here, I am not gonna put it here. I am going to place it kind of here. And what I do sometimes when working with these odd angles, it's I will trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance now, not at the end. So I am going to do that, and I'm going to show you why that makes it just a little bit easier. So now that I've trimmed that, it's easier for me to be able to see which way to place this fabric. So now I know it kind of has to go here. And then when I fold this to see if it covers section 5, you can see that it more than covers it. So then when I take this to my sewing machine, I just gotta make sure that I hold my fabric like so. And then when I open this, make sure that it doesn't move. Okay, so I'm back at the sewing machine now, and I'm holding on my fabric here. And in this case, I am starting at this junction and then sewing all the way off. So now we're back at my little pressing trimming station. So I'm just going to finger press this off to the side. And turn it over. So does it cover section 5? Yes, we're always checking to make sure. So section 5 is done. So now we need to do section 6. I'm going to trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance now. And at this point, I want to show you a handy tool. As you can see, you don't need any extra rulers or anything. But if you're doing a lot of foundation paper piecing, this ruler called at 1/4, it's really fantastic because it kind of butts up against your paper, so you don't have the issue of your ruler moving on you. So and the reason for that is because it has this lip on there. I don't know if you can see it, but it just kind of butts right up against your paper, and you get that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. But as you can see, I've been just using my regular ruler, and that works just fine. So now we need to cover section 6. So I'm gonna grab more fabric, and first I'm gonna make sure, is it big enough? It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but you can kind of see the lines. So yes, it's more than big enough. You can see the lines here. So yes, it's big enough. So I'm gonna fold the paper over again and line up this fabric so that let's see if you can see it, so that it covers section 6, and then take it to the machine and sew. Okay, so you can see I've sewn the seam here for section 6. So now I am going to press this fabric over. Next, I am going to do sections 7 and 8 really quick on my sewing machine, okay? So next we have to do section 9 because we have sections 1 through 8 all done. So we have to do 9. And I have my big white fabric here. And it's tempting, again, to just want to kind of place it there, sew the seam, but then the angles may not be right. So it's all about the angles with foundation paper piecing. So I am going to do my creasing method again. I'm going to add a pin here so that this fabric doesn't move on me. This green fabric that covers section 8. I don't want it moving around, so I added a pin there. And so now we have this here, and you can see here my paper ripped a little bit, but that's okay. So like I was saying, it's tempting to just kind of want to flop that down and sew. Even if you have a really big piece like this, the issue is when you fold it over, you're going to be missing that corner here. So what I like to do is crease it, trim my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then place my white fabric or the next fabric for the section, in this case section 9, and make sure that the fabric actually covers that entire area. And then I'm going to take this to a sewing machine and sew that seam. So now we're going to press this, and I'm just going to use kind of, I'm going to roll on the seam so that it presses. And now we just have to do the last seam over here for section 10. But before we do that, I'm kind of going to roughly trim this because that's just a lot of extra fabric that we don't need and we don't want getting in the way. And I'm actually going to check to see, can I use this extra fabric for section 10? It looks big enough, so let's try it. So I'm going to crease this. Just a rough crease on there. Oh, yep. This crease there, and I am going to trim here. So now when I'm placing this fabric for section 10, I want to be really careful how I place it. If I place it like this way, let's see, does it fit? It's kind of hard for me to show you on the camera, but it does fit. It goes all the way down to here. I can feel it with my fingers, so it fits. But it's kind of a tight fit. I wonder if this way. Oh yeah, that's better. It goes all the way down to here and here. I can kind of feel it with my fingers. It's hard to show on camera. So I just want to make sure that this doesn't shift at all when I am actually sewing. So I'm just going to hold it, and I'm actually going to throw in a pin here for this one at the top, and then at the back end I can just make sure it's not shifting on me. Okay, so here's my completed foundation paper piecing block. As you can see, we have these fun angles that you can't really get with traditional machine piecing. You kind of need that foundation, the paper, to show you how to do it. So the next thing to do here is to actually trim the block. So I grabbed my bigger ruler here, and I'm going to trim it. And you want to pay attention to where your the seam allowances are. So you want to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now that it's trimmed, the final step is to actually remove the paper, and this is when having that smaller stitch length really comes in handy, because they just really perforate the paper very nicely, and you can just start removing the paper. Now here you can see where I glued that to the paper. With a little water, this just comes right out, so you don't have to worry about that. And there is our finished block. At this point, you can add sashing to it, or if you sew more blocks, you can sew them all together. At this point, it's just like sewing any other quilting block. So there you have it, folks. I hope this tutorial on foundation paper piecing has been helpful, and it helps you tackle a new skill.